Okay, actually we talk about emergence. Emergence is one of those concepts that are quite difficult to define because there are different features that are usually associated with emergence, and emergent phenomena exhibit different features in different contexts and when analyzed by different disciplines. So there are obviously some agreements about what an emergent phenomenon is. So, ontologically emergent entities, by which I mean properties, relations, objects, processes, powers, and so on, depend on lower level goings on, while maintaining some autonomy, manifesting some novelty in relation to them. So these are the agreements. Obviously, there are parallel disagreements that has to do with how to clearly and precisely understand these three commonly recognized features, so dependence, autonomy, and novelty. So today I will focus on novelty, which for many authors is the most characteristic feature of emergent entities. And the problem is that, how highlighted by Paul Humphreys, novelty is usually required to be of a striking kind. But what counts as an acceptable kind of novelty is rarely, if ever, specified. So it is quite difficult to understand precisely what does it mean for an entity to be novel. Okay. So, in the contemporary debate, most views characterize emergent novelty in causal terms. Okay. So here I have some quotations from some quite classical papers about emergence. So we have Silverstein and McGeever that suggest that when we have emergence, we have causal capacities, novel causal capacities, not reducible to any of the intrinsic causal capacities of the parts. O'Connor and Wong, as a fundamentally new kind of feature, the emergent state will confer causal capacities that go beyond the summation of capacities directly conferred by the object microstructure. Here we have two passages from Jessica Wilson's recent book, Metaphysical Emergence. She formulates two schemes of emergence, weak and strong emergence, and in both cases the causal criterion is important. So we have a novel causal power, a fundamentally novel causal power in the case of strong emergence, and a non-empty proper subset of the total powers had by the base in the case of weak emergence, which means not a novel causal power, but a novel causal profile, so a novel set of causal powers. Paulini Poletti characterizes emergent powers as the entities, the emergent entities par excellence, and Causal in his book doesn't really commit to emergent powers, but talks about determination and constraining. Okay, so there are many other examples, but we can say that in many contemporary metaphysical accounts of emergence, ontological emergence, and also ontological relevance requires causal novelty, which surely is a novelty of striking kind. Okay, so a property in within these frameworks is ontologically novel when it confers novel capacities or powers, when it instantiates a novel causal profile, like in Jessica Wilson's weak emergence, or when it is constraining or determinative. So why is this a striking kind of novelty? Because of a quite ancient metaphysical principle that we can find already in Plato's Sophist, which is the electric principle, which is that to be real, to exist, is to have some capacity. Okay? This is a very important principle in the emergentist debate, because one of the first authors reintroducing the concept of emergence in the contemporary debate, Jacomo, did a quite tricky move in the 90s. So in his papers, he analyzes a passage that comes from the Introduction of Space, Time and Deity, which is probably the most important book by Samuel Alexander, which is one of those the philosophers called British emergentists, which are those authors that introduced in the philosophical debate the concept of emergence and formulated the concept of emergence at the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th century. And here, Alexander is just expressing an anti-phenomenalist view about the mind. But Kim translates this view as follows. Kim says, this we may call Alexander's dictum. To be real is to have causal powers. This is very similar to the electric principle, but Kim associates with this principle with Alexander, and so with the British emergentism generally. Okay. Okay, so what advantages of intending causally emergent novelty. Because this is not wrong, okay? I'm not saying that it is wrong. Obviously, there are a lot of advantages. So, causal novelty is a striking kind of novelty. Emergent causal novelty is quite easily definable. You can say that you have a novel fundamental power, you can have a novel capacity. Causal properties are easily detectable. You can even say maybe we can detect only causal properties, okay? And the elective principle, or Alexander's dictum, seems a combined criterion for existence. Okay, so clearly there are a lot of advantages. But if you know the literature about emergence, you also know that there are a lot of disadvantages as well. So admitting emergent causal properties, which means higher level causal properties, generates the exclusion problems, it challenges the causal closure of the physical world, and it might require some reformulation of our accounts of realization, of causation, or also of what does it mean to be physical. Okay. Now, what I want to point out is that we have a sort of meta disadvantage that is less probably known and focused on. If emergent novelty is merely understood in causal terms, causal properties, or if you do not believe in intrinsically causal properties like causal powers, the causal aspects of properties will be the only relevant features in conferring the status of emergent. And this can be problematic, as you will see. Okay, so if we take seriously this disadvantage, I think that some questions emerge. And the questions are the following. So, are there non-primarily causal emergent properties? And if there are, what kind of properties are they? And what kind of emergent novelty do these non-primary causal properties provide? So, this is a spoiler. I will answer in this way. Okay. Okay, so let's start from the first answer. From the first question. So, are there non-primarily causal emergent properties? And I will answer this question by showing you some examples and mentioning you a lot of examples actually. And I would like to start from the British emergentist. Okay. So British emergentists, I think, offered a wide list of examples of emergent features that they called emergent qualities, and that I think are non-primarily causal properties. So I'm a bit more expert in Samuel Alexander and Lloyd Morgan, so I will talk about them. But actually, we can find very similar ideas in all of them. Okay, so Lloyd Morgan, in his book Emergent Evolution, he was very interested in evolution. He wrote, if it be asked, what is it that you claim to be emergent? The brief reply is some new kind of relation. As an expression of its new intrinsic relations, the higher entity has new qualities. And each higher entity in the ascending series is an emergent complex of many entities of lower grades, within which a new kind of relatedness gives integral unity. So we can say that the kind of properties that Alexander is interested in are new kinds of relatedness endowed with an integral unity. So we have new organizations, new relational properties, with these new wholeness or oneness or holistic features. And quite the same can be found in Samuel Alexander. He had a very sophisticated metaphysical systems, and he wrote in Space, Time and Deity, the kind of existence from which the new quality emerges is the matter which assumes a certain complexity of configuration, and to this pattern of or universal corresponds the new emergent quality again. And space-time then is the stuff which receives determination in the qualities it assumes as its complexity of grouping develops in time. So again, we have new qualities that emerge from new groupings. Alexander called them constellations and so on. And these qualities are defined as the characters that give to new complex structures their individuality. And Dorothy Emmett, who was a friend and colleague of Alexander in Manchester, wrote that these new the qualities that he's talking about are new qualitative synthesis. Okay. Okay, so we can say that within these frameworks, emergent properties are configurational or structural properties whose characterizing feature is a quality which corresponds to the property of being a whole, so of being one despite being composed by parts. Now, obviously, they talk about causal efficacy. Causal efficacy is mentioned by both these authors, but it seems a consequence of a deeper structural difference. So there is this new relatedness, this new quality, and then we have effective qualities. Okay. Here I have a quotation, but it's too long, I don't have time to read it. Okay, now, keep in mind these new structural properties and new numerical properties, we can say, namely being one, despite being composed by parts. And if you know the literature, the recent literature about complexity science, you will probably find some similarities. Because actually, complexity scientists who very often talk about emergence, because emergence is one of the characteristics of complex systems, usually discuss about novel patterns, novel structures, novel forms of organization. And they also talk about these holistic features of these systems. So, here comes from the introduction of this very big work, foundational papers in complexity science that have been published by the Santa Fe Institute, which is one of the, maybe the most important research center about complexity. And David Krakauer, who is the director of the institute and the editor of this series, he says literally a whole, he's talking about complex systems, a whole made from parts implies a reduction in number. So from n, which is the number of the parts, to 1, which is the number of the system. Okay. Okay, so there are a lot of other more recent examples of emergent non-causal properties. I obviously cannot describe all of them, but maybe some of you think about consciousness. So we have qualia that in Chalmers have no causal roles. We have quantum entanglement, where again we have these emergent features because we have holistic correlations. In recent theories of space-time, which is considered as non-fundamental and emergent from a known spatial-temporal structure, is defined as qualitatively different because of this spatial-temporality. Well, chimericity, which is a perceptual property on which is working my student, Linda, again, has to do with the idea of wholeness, and it's very similar to a concept that Alexander and Morgan discussed, which is that of coordinates. Then Marmador, she is publishing a paper in which she's suggesting that the first emergentist wasn't really Aristotle but Plato, because the structural forms are partless complexes, so again we have this partlessness. And then we have several automata patterns on which I will be back, because I have a small case study, so I'll be back on this. Okay, so this was to answer the first question. Okay, I'm on time. Okay, so what kind of properties are these properties, all these properties that we described? And to answer this question, I think that we can rely on a quite canonical distinction in the debate about ontology of properties, and we already talked about this, so thank you. Okay, so this distinction is that between dispositional and categorical properties. So there are different ways in which these properties are described, and in which this distinction is cashed out. I will describe the two most interesting, I think, way in which we can distinguish categorical and dispositional properties. So the first one is by highlighting the modal strength with which these properties confer to their bearers their causal roles. Okay. And yeah, I have the same example too. So categorical properties confer causal roles contingently. So if you have a spherical object, the sphericality is a categorical property, you have an object that has also the capacity to roll. Okay. So sphericality confers a rollability. But categorical properties are usually defined as properties that confer their causal roles just contingently. Okay, so it's not true that in all possible worlds you have spherical objects that roll. Think about a world in which there's no time. Okay. On the other hand, dispositional properties confer their causal roles as a matter of metaphysical necessity. Okay. So another classic example, being soluble, necessarily disposes its bearer to behave in certain ways under certain circumstances. So if an object is soluble, it will dissolve under certain instances. So I know that this is problematic, but this is a classic example, so I'm just mentioning it. Okay, so this is the first way in which we can distinguish dispositional and categorical properties. There is another one, which is again already been described, and it has to do with the essential nature of these properties. So the nature of categorical properties has some irreducible feature characterizing it essentially. Again, think about what we said before about the sphericality. Being spherical is not just the capacity to roll, it's not identical to the capacity to roll. While, on the other hand, being soluble is the capacity to dissolve. Okay, so while the nature of categorical properties has some irreducible feature that characterizes it, and sometimes this feature is called liquidity, the nature of dispositional properties is exhausted by their nomological profiles, by the causal roles and causal powers that they confer. Okay. So, just to sum up, dispositional properties usually determine the behavior of their bearers. This is another way to distinguish them. They confer their causal roles as a matter of metaphysical necessity, and their identity is fixed by their nomological profiles. While categorical properties determine how their bearers are, not how they behave. They confer their causal roles contingently, and their identity is fixed by some irreducible features whose nature is non-causal. So we can say that dispositional properties are primarily causal properties and categorical properties are primarily qualitative properties. And actually in the literature, categorical properties are also called qualitative properties. Okay, so obviously this works if you accept that there are dispositional properties and categorical properties. If you think that properties have a double nature, a mixed nature, so properties have both dispositional and categorical aspects or nature, the distinction is between aspects of properties and not between types of properties. Okay, so what kind of emergent novelty do these categorical properties confer? Now, quite trivially, we can say that having new dispositional property means being causally novel, and having new categorical properties means being qualitatively novel. And categorical emergent properties prevalently belong to two market categories. If you think again to the examples I made about the British emergentists and also the more recent example and the example coming from the complexity science, we can say that categorically emergent properties are usually all structural properties, and so they confer what we can say structural novelty, or they are numerical properties, and they confer a kind of novelty that we can call novelty number. Actually, this is an expression I found in Adamano's paper. So my suggestion, my proposal is that when we have an example of these, we have qualitative novelty. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to choose, because often an emergent phenomenon can be both qualitatively and causally novel. And actually this happens quite often. So I think that in most ontological domains, novel causal properties are realized by novel qualitative properties. I'm using realized later. I will use ground. It's not exactly clear to me which is exactly the relationship between these. I will be back on this, the general idea is that causal properties in some ontological domains are realized or grounded in qualitative properties. And this is the reason why I think that we need a metaphysics of emergence considering both causal and qualitative novelty. That would be a more complete metaphysics of emergence. Okay, so I have a case study that I took from the biological domain because I really love biology, I love animals. So I have an example about a lizard. And why the biological domain is interesting? Well, it is interesting, but there are various reasons. But among these, there is this reason that in the biological domain it is well known that new causal roles or activities, by which I mean new biological functions. The concept of function in biology can be intended in different ways. I will just consider new causal roles, new activities, new causal activities. So in biology, new biological functions require underlying structures. both at the molecular and at the anatomical level. And I will read a passage from David Causal that I think it's very interesting. They are biologists, not philosophers, and they say, as practitioners of biology, it seems difficult to us to reason on function as a general abstract concept set aside of any context. Conversely, the observation of biological reality leads us to discover at every level of biological integration the occurrence of structural functional complexes, where the doing of living things is always supported by a given materiality, the structure. So what I think is that if we just focus on the functional or causal properties of an entity, or of an emergent phenomenon, without looking at underlying structure, and very often we do that because we say, oh, that's just the emergent phase, and so it's physical, and so it's okay. Well, if you just do that, we will formulate partial descriptions of the phenomena that we want to explore and investigate. Okay, so, my case study. So, in 2024, I wrote a paper about this case study, and I do that building on this other paper has been published in 2016, I think, by a group of biologists working here in Switzerland. And these authors highlighted that the dynamics governing the pigmentation process, the ontogeny of the pigmentation patterns of the ocellated lizard, which is this lizard, perfectly reflect all the features characterizing a two-dimensional cellular automaton. Okay. So this one is a two-dimensional cellular automaton. And maybe if you know that, but in 1997, Marc Bedeau took CA cellular automata as examples of systems producing weakly emergent patterns. And he says that these patterns are weakly emergent because they are dependent from the microdynamics and the micro components. They are nomologically autonomous from them, but they are causally ineffective. Okay? And in virtual CA, these patterns really seem causally ineffective. But in 2024, I say, yeah, maybe in virtual CA, these patterns are weakly emergent because they are causally ineffective. But what happens when we look at them in living CA, so in these lizards? And actually, lizards, patterns do perform biological functions, quite obviously. And they perform at least two kinds of functions. First of all, they are an instance of disrupting coloration. So they are useful for camouflage. Okay? And the second function that they perform, which is very interesting, is that they carry information about the social status of the individual. So they serve as badges of status. So they are features conveying social information about the bearer, so about the animal that exhibits them. And this is very important. It has a very important role in male competition and reproduction, because the conspecific can look at each other and understand the social status of the other ones and say, okay, maybe I don't fight with him, because otherwise. Okay. Okay. So, in my paper I concluded that despite the similarity between virtual and real CA, pigmentation patterns in real CA are not causally irrelevant. They perform important biological functions. So I asked, is this an instance of strong ontological emergence? And I answered, yes. But what I didn't answer, and what I didn't question and what I would like to question now, is exactly in virtue of what is this an instance of strong ontological emergence? Because I just answered, oh yeah, there's dependence and then there's causal novelty. But maybe there's something more. And I think that a more complete explanation in this case would consider three features and not just two. So yes, we have dependence because we have the patterns that depend on the scales of the lizards. But we have qualitative novelty because evolution produces new geometric properties, the patterns. And these patterns make possible causal novelty because we have these new causal properties, we have these new biological functions that are possible thanks to the geometric properties. So, pigmentation patterns conveying biological information correspond to a novel type of qualitative property that appeared during the history of life and performs novel biological functions. And this is an example of a case in which emergent qualitative novelty grounds, again in a quite vague sense of the term, but surely not big G grounds, emergent causal novelty. Okay, so conclusions. By complementing the concept of emergent causal novelty with that of emergent qualitative novelty, I wish to suggest the theoretical viability of emergence in multiple metaphysical frameworks. Why are you doing that? Because emergence can be a useful conceptual tool if you think that qualitative properties do not exist. So in the contemporary debate, maybe you think that qualitative properties exist, but you are really focused on causal powers, and so you recognize novel causal powers. But you can use emergence even if you think that dispositional properties do not exist. Like the British Emergentists. They were Humean about causation. They do not believe in causal powers. Okay. But they do recognize they did recognize emergent qualities. Or you can think that there are these two types of properties, and maybe you have both kind of novelty. So the take-home message here is that anyone can be an emergentist if she wants. It's not mandatory, but you can do it. Okay. Now, obviously, there are a lot of problems. So, when exactly are these properties novel? So, how can you really define novel, a qualitative property? But I think that causal theories have quite the same problem. Because you can say, well, that's a new causal power. But then in reality, it's not so easy to identify a really new causal power and distinguish this new causal power, this new higher level causal power from the lower level causal powers. I mean, reductionists usually use this difficulty to criticize emergentism. What is the precise relationship between qualitative and causal novelty, as I said before? Which is probably the more general problem about the relationship between categorical and dispositional properties. Is there a distinction between weak and strong emergence when qualitative novelty is involved? Because we have it usually catch down in terms of different causal contributions. And are there criteria to understand whether and how qualitative novelty is compatible with physicalism? So these are open problems, but despite this problem, I think that integrating the causal criterion with a non-causal criterion can do justice to the British Emergentist, can offer us more complete explanations and descriptions of some emergent phenomena, and can also allow us to formulate more pluralist and liberal accounts of emergence. And I suppose that there would be other open problems suggested by Giacomo. So, thank you.
We now have a comment by Giannini.
Thanks, Annika. This was really fun. Although you were incredibly rude at pointing out the open problems and making my job much difficult. But I'll try to be extremely brief. So I have one maybe methodological question and then a couple of slightly more technical worries about properties. So the methodological question is, what exactly is the role of the historical bit concerning the British Emergentists to... I assume that you're right. I haven't read Time of Alexander and all that crowd. So assuming that you're right, that they did focus on qualitative properties over the causal ones, should we take this as having any normative force on theorizing about emergence, or is it just like, hey look, different people had different ideas, how cool, maybe we should not be set no causal weight so much. Whether it's, you take it to be a desideratum of any theory of emergence that you can accommodate the grandfathers of the phenomenon. Now to the slightly more metaphysic-y bits. So I take your proposal to have two steps, right? The first one is to say, look, we need to have a more generalized theory about emergence. So novelty is usually taken to be only causal novelty, but we want also to have qualitative novelty. And the second step is identifying what this qualitative novelty is with categorical properties. I'm happy with the first move. Right, I assume that, well, there are two ways of reading it, right? One is the sort of more, the one that you played with in your example, say, look, there is both qualitative and causal novelty, but I also assume that you take it to be mere qualitative novelty to be sufficient for emergence. So causal powers are the same, but there is only a qualitative property emerging. I'm working under that assumption, correct me if I'm wrong. If this is the case, though, I'm a bit worried that identifying that qualitative aspect with categorical properties, and I take qualitative properties to be defined in the way that also the previous talk did, in the sort of, their essence is not exhausted by the causal rule, causal profile. Because I think that emergence might become way too cheap and a bit too easy to generate. So we might think, look, the only qualitative property that is novel is just a syncretistic property or a hack-scientific property. So we've got the same causal base. Let's say that we have the emergent base, let's call it X, and then we have the emergent entity, let's call it Y, and the only difference in the properties is that Y has a qualitative property, like being identical to Fred, or being identical to property G. And I'm not sure that I would be comfortable to think that that is novel enough to be a kind of emergence, just from a matter of intuition. And note that it would turn out that every case of dependence turns out to be a case of emergence, right? Because all the properties that are grounded have uniquely the property of being grounded by the base. That the base obviously doesn't have, right? So if A grounds B, then B will uniquely have the property of being grounded by A. That obviously the grounding property doesn't have. So any case of dependence becomes a case of emergence. And so I don't know whether that you'd be happy with that or not. I think there could be an easy fix here to sort of limit yourself to thick quiddities or to thick properties as opposed to thin quiddities, but I'm not sure how much, whether that just solves the problem or not. And yeah, I think that I let more time for questions.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really nice.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of stuff here. So I will start from a kind of comment about probably different expectations about the concept of emergence. Because you say, I'm worried that maybe emergence becomes too cheap. And actually, this is called a rarity heuristic in the literature. Was formulated by Paul Humphreys, this expression. And I don't think that many really contemporary emergentists still believe in that. Actually, I don't believe in that. I think that emergence is pervasive. And in this I follow the British emergentists, because actually, like Lloyd Morgan explicitly say that every new kind of atom, any new kind of molecule, every new kind of biological organization, that is a case of emergence. And actually, British emergentists use the concept of emergence as a sort of complementary metaphysical principle to evolution. So obviously, it is so pervasive. This doesn't mean that it is trivial, because evolution is not trivial just because every biological trait is subject to evolution. Okay? And so maybe the same can be said about emergence. So I think that emergence is pervasive. So I don't agree with this rarity heuristic. This is just to... Okay. Then, about the British emergentists. Well, that's a real worry. I mean, we can say, well, they just think that's about emergence, but we can change, obviously, our mind. The problem is that most contemporary emergentists associate their theories to the British emergentists. And this is a tradition that has been started by Giacomo. In 2006, Kim said that a good theory of emergence should show an adequate continuity with the British emergentist ideas. So, even just say, okay, no, I don't want to do that anymore. Okay, so let's forget British emergentists. But if you recall them, if you say that you are kind of receiving their heritage, maybe you should read them and respect them a bit more. No, because they are very interesting authors. They are very interesting. They formulate very interesting philosophies. Okay. Then, metaphysically speaking. Okay, this is serious. Okay, I agree with you. And I agree with you. I agreed with you even before knowing your comments, because I didn't really... I'm not an expert in the debate about the ontology of properties, so I didn't really know of these strange entities, thin quiddities. I mean, when you point that out to me, I go reading, and I say, oh wow, these are very mysterious entities. I didn't really have that in mind. I had in mind what are called thick quiddities, sure. So if you think about the example that I did, the structural properties, they have some nature which is not just a mysterious and primitive quiddity. It's not just being identical to something. They have I don't know, sphericality, like Low's definition of sphericality. There is a geometric formula that defines sphericality. It is a qualitative, maybe thick qualitative property. Hildebrand talks about these robust qualitative quiddities. They are always quiddities maybe because they are primitive, but yes, I think that thin quiddities should be excluded, and thank you because I will insert these on the paper. And then yes, you used an expression which is crucial, novel enough. Right. We need to have a striking kind of novelty, even for qualitatively novel properties, not just for causal novel properties. Okay, so and this is one of the problems. I'm still working. I'm very hardly working at finding some criteria for saying that this qualitative property is novel. And actually, I have some idea. They cannot just be different. I mean, being grounded on B is something that. But actually, this is the same. Even if you say this is supervenient on B, this is realized by B. So actually, yeah. But yes, we need to find some relevantly novel properties. And for instance, I think that qualitative properties, to be strikingly novel, they should be robust, so there should be some robustness. They can be universal, like suggested by complexity scientists, so multiply realizable. And obviously, they can confer causal roles. So I'm not sure, and last point, I'm not sure that we can have mere qualitative novelty case of emergence. But why I don't think that this is possible? Because I don't. Okay, this is very complex. I don't really believe in dispositional properties. Okay, I talk about causal roles, and I think that when we have qualitative properties, these qualitative properties are always associated with causal roles because the world is made as it's made. So if you think about the laws of nature, I mean, if you have a ball, the ball will roll. Not because it has an intrinsic capacity to roll. This is a causal role. And so we can have qualitative novelty with novel causal roles, but not with novel causal powers. And so I don't know if this is for you on a merely qualitative novelty or also. So I think that it depends on the theory of causation or the theory of property that you adopt. I answered. Yes, but very interesting question. Thank you so much.
I really like all your answers. I'm slightly worried that you might have troubles to get the numerical kind of emergence that you want, right? Because that really looks to me like a thin quidity or like a thin.
Okay. Yes.
But everything else is amazing.
No, yes, it's true. I mean, the concept of holism is very often mentioned, but actually it's not really, it's very well described. But I'm writing a paper exactly on this because it is something that should be clarified.
Awesome.
Thank you, Giacomo.
Okay, thank you. We have 20 minutes for Q&A. Please consider.
I have two questions. I think this kind of talk is super interesting and it's very relevant for a lot of stuff in biology and evolution. One is a clarificatory question and one is just a normal question. So if I understand correctly, we can have emergent qualitative novelties when we have a new structure and a reduction in number. I mean, it's a very simplified, I'm not good with this stuff. So my question would be if with the emergence of a new structure we necessarily have also an emergence of new causal properties, which are the causes that keep the structure together. And the second would be, it comes from the very example you made about the laser scheme. There is an emergence of certain geometric patterns and it's then co-opted, functioning by what the laser does with that. And I'm thinking, or maybe like in evolution there was a mutation that favored these patterns. So it would be a case of emergent qualitative novelty, but which would somehow come from a causal novelty which is not emergent, where the causal novelty is a mutation which does not emerge on anything, it's just a new thing that has happened. Like it is absolutely
just be a causal process.
Yeah, but it's new in the sense that it's a mutation that doesn't come from anything else.
Okay, yes. Well, actually, mutations are examples. I mean, in some frameworks, mutations are examples of emergent phenomena. Yeah, I have to think about that because this is very interesting. Because I mean, a mutation. I think that the mutation can be both structural and functional. Probably at the beginning it is functional, and then depending on the context, on the environment, it becomes functional in some sense. But, okay, yes. The question that you asked is very similar to what we were discussing with Giacomo, which is when you have a new structure, you need to have a new function, for instance. And I used the word contingently when I was describing the model strength with which qualitative properties confer causal roles. Because I think that it is metaphysically contingent, but it is not logically necessary given the laws of nature that we have. So in this world with the actual laws of nature, and it isn't enough. And in the context in which a biological trait appears, it has that function. But obviously that function can change. The structure may be the same. I mean, think about the expectation. Okay, you have the same structure, then you have different functions because the conditions change. This is the reason why I think I'm so interested in structure. I think they are more, solid, robust, while function can change.
It's easier to have a functional novelty than a structural novelty in that sense. I mean, is that what you're pointing at?
Maybe.
That's why it works. Right.
But again, the novelty should be relevant, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
No, but like the thing, what I was asking, maybe I didn't understand the answer, is that to have a structural novelty, we also need some kind of causal novelty that keeps the structural novelty together. Like to have a structural novelty, we need new causal powers for that kind of structure.
We need causal interactions.
Right.
And I wouldn't say these are our powers.
Okay.
Thank you, Erica. Hi. I find this a very novel and refreshing approach to this discussion of emergence, which has taken so many people to talk about, maybe too much. So this is a very refreshing way of doing it. I have one worry, to be honest, and the worry is about the qualitative novelty reducing to causal novelty, essentially. Because inevitably, in order to access epistemic here to see causal novelty, won't some causal talk creep in? And if it creeps in like that, then doesn't it suggest that it's just a form of causal novelty? How can we really distinguish between the two in a way that, you can... I get that it is based on the consideration of different types of properties, but then when you try to access and say, okay, this is qualitatively novel, you said it also when you replied to Giacomo, you talk in causal terms about it. So maybe this is suggestive of causal novelty, and I'm not, that's my thing.
Okay. So would you say that the patterns are not totally qualitative, and to say that these are...
They are novel, but they are novel because they do stuff. So they're causal. That brings in causation, no?
They are novel. Well, if you just look at the geometric property, and you compare that geometric property with other, like if you compare the aspect of those lizards with the aspects of other animals not showing those factors, they are different.
So patterns in the colors, you mean?
Yeah. Like for instance, I don't have the image here, but in the paper by the Lugano, there's these pictures of like the juvenile form of the lizard and then the adult. Obviously, it develops, and the one that I showed you is an adult with the patches formed. In the juvenile form, the animal is just brown. So you have a qualitative difference, and that qualitative difference you can just, it's a qualitative difference. Then, yeah, it emerged because of causal processes. It was maybe retaining evolution because of its biological function. But I think that the geometric property is not causal. It's not intrinsically causal. But I see your worry because it also depends on how you consider. Again, as I was saying, it also depends on the theory of causation that you have. Because if you don't recognize intrinsically causal properties, you just have causal laws. Maybe causal laws is just too weak. So you need the qualitative properties having causal laws.
Yes, but that's the thing. The qualitative properties having causal laws. Maybe saying that is a bit of a trap because immediately it brings in causation.
Yes, and actually this is the reason why I think that when we talk about qualitative novelty, in order to have strong emergence, we need those, but we can have weak emergence when we have just heterogeneity, robustness, universality, but not also causal novelty.
Interesting. Okay.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I surely have to think more about this, because it's tricky, this relationship. And also the fact that when we talk, we use causal concepts.
Yes,
so
that's the worry, right?
Yeah. I try to stay away from epistemology.
Thank you. This was a really nice talk. It was so nice that it left me deeply, deeply confused.
Okay.
It's like about other things. And so I'm going to try to just articulate what that confusion is. So to say that something is novel is to say that it is numerically distinct from anything that came before or something like that, right? And this presupposes a standard of equivalence. So like to say that a property is novel is to say that it's numerically distinct from.
Not just that. It also should be qualitatively different. Otherwise it's just different. Otherwise it's just distinct.
Can you say more about it?
I mean, the is to. I think it's the classic way to distinguish things. I mean, these are distinct, but they are qualitatively identical, but they are not numerically identical.
Yeah.
So you have distinction, and you have just distinction. But these and these, they are distinct, but also qualitatively.
Yeah, fair. Okay, so it presupposes that these two things are distinct. Okay. And to say that they're distinct presupposes a standard of equivalence for how we're individuating properties in these things. And that's where I'm a little lost on. It's like, what is this standard of when we're saying that two properties are the same property or when they're distinct properties? And I don't think, let's say, moving to causal properties and talking about causal roles is going to, or causal powers is going to fix this, right? Because then we're presupposing a standard of when two causal powers are equivalent. So like, is the causal power of this water bottle to read 1.5 kilograms on a digital scale the same causal power as if I had, a mechanical scale where I place it on there with a 1.5 kilogram. And so I'm sort of just, I don't know what to say about when.
Maybe it's a trivial answer, but I think that you have just to find a way to define the properties and then compare the definitions.
Yeah. So like.
I mean, I can't see the third. I mean, are you suggesting that there's a third element to compare the two, or just a criterion?
We just need a criterion, and I'm just. I'm not sure where that comes from, and it feels like there's some sort of implicit criterion underneath a lot of this. Like the subset realization view of properties wants to say it has to be the same description, so synonymous properties, right?
Okay, so you have the same causal profile if you have the same set of properties, and you can say this is the same property.
Yeah, where same property means synonymous, like literal same description of the properties.
Okay.
But that's a very strong sense of
Yes.
equivalence between properties.
Okay.
And so I'm just confused about what.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe this is something we can talk about later if it's not.
Yeah, I still think it has to do with the way in which we identify properties. So we have to find a way to define qualitative properties, but also scalar properties, I think.
Yeah.
And then, if the definition is, it should be a good definition and informative and so on and so forth. And then you compare the definitions, and I know that partially it's always stipulative. I know.
Yeah.
Because there are some criteria that are considered salient and others that are not.
Yeah.
But I think that this is something that we have to accept. There's always a certain degree of arbitrariness.
Yeah. But that arbitrariness, so this standard of equivalence between properties underlies the very idea of a novel property.
Yeah, but for instance, qualitative properties, you do not really need to define them. This is red, this is black. It's in mid. It was like he was saying. Or like Russell's acquaintance, direct acquaintance. In the case of qualitative properties, you just see that these properties, the two properties are different. And this is the reason why I think that with causal powers is even more difficult, because you don't see them. So you don't even have that. That criteria, that you direct knowledge.
We can move on.
Thank you.
So it's a follow-up?
Well, it's a question, okay? If there is time, otherwise I
Yeah, so first, please. Thank you. So my question is really similar to the one in the back, but from a different angle a little bit. And I'm also, so not knowing the details, I'm curious about to what extent are you proposing something novel, or rather making explicit commitment of the causal view, and just why. So you say that we should recognize that sometimes the things that emerge have qualitative, novel properties rather than causal, and the main reason you give for why we should be interested in recognizing that is that these novel qualitative properties explain novel causal properties, or something like that.
But they are interesting for the second.
Okay. Assuming the sometimes version, my question would have been that, but assuming that like whenever you say that a thing has a causal power, you assume that it has the causal power in virtue of having some other kind of property, some kind of structure and so on. So whoever says that, oh, we have emergent novel causal properties, you're already implicitly committing to the view that it also has novel non-qualitative properties.
Maybe it is, but it is. If it is, it's very implicit because in the debate usually you have the emergent. Usually you have a hierarchical view in which you have the emergent space that is just considered physical, just an aggregation of entities and some relations. But what is interesting for the emergent is what emerged from the emergent space. So usually you have these two views. You have the emergent phenomenon and the emergent space. And the emergent space is uncontroversial. What is controversial is the emergent phenomenon, which is not in some sense independence, but partially dependent, just partially dependent, autonomous, but there is not clear way. So usually the debate, this is how I consider and understood the debate. I work with this.
Is what you're saying that we can have different and not? Are you saying that causal properties don't supervene on something structural?
No, I'm saying something else. But I'm saying that between these two levels, just the physical consequence and the emergence phase, I think that very often there's a kind of intermediate level, which is these qualitative properties that are structural. And in some cases, in certain ontological domains, these intermediate level make possible the emergent causal level.
You see that 20 minutes?
I have a very basic question. So,
don't hate me. In the sense, okay, my point is that if I think that the pattern envisaged is emergent, then I have to think that every developmental stage of an organism is emergent, because every development, I mean, the pattern of the lizard is a developmental stage of the lizard, right? But then every developmental stage that we can identify somehow is qualitatively novel, and probably also causal novel. And so this becomes a very, very large view of it. Really everything is emergent, right? So is there a way to distinguish somehow?
So, again, the problem of criteria of the kind of novelty that we need, yes, otherwise everything is emergent. And actually, the problem of the patterns, I mean, this is a quite easy example, because
It's a beautiful one.
it's a beautiful one, but it's also, in some sense, like a bit cheating, because the patterns are already considered emergent by all the studies by Marco Joe and many others. Because actually the patterns, I mean, what is interesting in several automata is that they are incompressible. You cannot predict the evolution of the system. Okay, so you cannot predict the formation of these patterns as they are. You just have to let the system go. So you have to observe the lizard evolving, well, not evolving, sorry, growing, and then you can say, okay, now we have this pattern, and obviously there are some rules, but you cannot predict the particular pattern. And this is a quite a standard model for emergence.
Yeah, but that can be said of every developmental stage at a certain scale. You can predict the kind of developmental stage, but you cannot predict exactly every.
But here the problem is not the developmental stage. Here are some particular properties of that stage, which are those pigmentation properties, that are those geometric properties. It's the same with shells that have the same mechanism, just one dimension, because they grow, and it happens in a lot of lizards actually. But this is, yeah, I mean, this is a quite canonical example, because emergent patterns, I mean, this paper by Mark Below with emergence is very, very famous, and it is usually uncontroversial.
Yeah, no, but it's a problem of mine, as I said.
No, but I understand.
don't understand emergence.
No, but I see your point, and actually, I mean, yes, I think that emergence is pervasive, but I have to be careful, because there's this, well, delimitation problem, you told me.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
We have to consecrate it.
And then there is a more question, but it's more empirical, sorry. Let's say is it the geometrical structure that does the job? So they know that it is the geometrical structure that works?
This is what I read on some biologists' papers.
So they
and I also write to them.
They experimentally
yes.
prove that it's the geometrical
It is the
structure.
pattern.
Okay.
It is not just the color, not just
Okay.
it is the pattern.
Okay.
And that's because it's interesting. Because it's not just the color.
Uh-huh.
It's red, so it's dendron, so I don't need it. But it's the pattern, which is a more sophisticated and qualitative property. Because just being red,
Yeah,
it wasn't.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? If not, please join me in thanking you very much.